individuals, as well as earned revenue from news organizations. The Center publishes investigative studies which serve as vital reference material for journalists, academicians, and policymakers alike. Our studies, but also our files, are open to interested researchers. The purpose of the Center is to bring important, sometimes inaccessible information to the attention of the American people. The past 4 years, the Center has produced 15 studies about public service and ethics-related issues. Today, we are releasing Saving for a Rainy Day 2, How Congress Uses Leftover Campaign Cash, written by Kevin Chafee. It is a comprehensive investigative study about how former members of Congress spend their excess campaign funds. The Center for Public Integrity first examined the controversial grandfather clause issue in a March 1991 study, also written by Chafee, which found that 73 former members of Congress had converted over $6 million to personal use. The updated study contains cumulative and recent figures compiled from Federal Election Commission records of over 200 members of Congress who left office during the period 1979 to 1993. The author was one of the first journalists to describe the phenomenon of former members of Congress converting leftover campaign funds for personal use. His article in the September 1984 issue of Washington Monthly, Money Under the Mattress, What Congressmen Don't Spend, was nominated for 3 major journalism awards and was the subject of a national public radio program. Chafee has researched or written about campaign finance issues over the years for the Almanac of American Politics, Campaign and Elections Journal, and the Campaign Research Center, all in Washington, and the Citizens Research Foundation in Los Angeles. Currently a features editor at the Washington Times, he has also worked as a consultant to Congressional Quarterly, Incorporated. Chafee holds an AB and an MA degrees in history from Georgetown University and an MA degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. Most Americans probably do not expect former members of Congress to pocket their campaign money. And in fact, we want to point out that many former members of Congress leaving office did not directly or indirectly take advantage of this quirky law and convert their campaign funds to personal use. Finally, none of the instances we discussed this morning, replete with names and dollar amounts, are illegal, in part because it is Congress who writes the laws of this land. Over the past 15 years, several former members of Congress have taken advantage of a grandfather clause in an obscure 1979 amendment to the 1971 Federal Election Campaign Act, allowing them to help themselves to millions of dollars in leftover campaign funds before they leave office. The loophole made it completely legal for former members to convert campaign war chests to personal use if their congressional service began before January 8, 1980. A public outcry ensued after continued revelations that many former members had taken advantage of this windfall, compelling and embarrassed Congress to abolish the provision. The resulting legislation, the Ethics Reform Act of 1989, forced the grandfathered members to make a decision to retire before the beginning of the 103rd Congress if they wanted to keep their leftover campaign funds. Like their less senior colleagues, grandfathered members serving again would be required on leaving office to give all unspent funds to political or charitable causes. Based on an exhaustive examination of campaign finance records available at the Federal Election Commission, the Center for Public Integrity has found that since 1979, 112 former members of Congress used an estimated $10.5 million in unspent contributions from individual donors, national parties, and political action committees for essentially non-election related purposes. Former members, or in case of death, their committees, transferred the largest part of this total, approximately $6 million, to personal accounts or to the deceased members' beneficiaries. The remaining, approximately $4.5 million, was used to cover post-retirement office, travel, entertainment, and other so-called political expenses, or to pay personal legal fees in criminal trials or congressional ethics probes. We found that 23 members who left office in 1993 converted approximately $2.4 million directly to personal use or used leftover funds for various post-retirement expenditures. Of the former members of Congress who left in 1993, 7 disposed of more than $100,000 each in leftover campaign funds. Cumulatively, since the 1979 grandfather clause was written into law, 26 members have used their election funds to legally dispose of $100,000 or more apiece via transfers to personal use, personal legal fees, or post-retirement expenses. No parachute was more golden than the one for former Representative Larry Hopkins, Republican of Kentucky, who took $665,000. He had pledged not to use his leftover campaign funds for personal benefit in his failed 1991 gubernatorial bid, offering to sign a pledge to that effect in a televised campaign appearance. The previous record had been held by the heirs of the late Representative John Duncan, Jr. of Tennessee, who received $605,000 in leftover campaign funds. Former Representative Bob Traxler, Democrat of Michigan, converted $295,000 to personal use. Like Hopkins, Traxler had previously promised publicly not to keep his excess campaign funds. Carol Hubbard, Democrat of Kentucky, converted $216,000 to personal use. Hubbard and his wife pled guilty in April 1994 to unrelated criminal charges of misusing campaign contributions. The findings cast light on a phenomenon stretching across partisan and ideological lines. This study and the earlier study include a wide range of use by such well-known figures as Vice President Albert Gore, Secretary of Agriculture Mike Espy, Office of Management Budget Director Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense Les Aspin, former Speakers of the House Thomas O'Neill and Jim Wright, former Vice Presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro, former Secretary of Agriculture Edward Madigan, former Veterans Affairs Secretary Edward Derwinski, and former ONB Director David Stockman. An additional way former members of Congress use residual funds is by establishing a personal foundation or charitable trust. 7 such entities are currently in existence after the transfer of $2.7 million from individual campaign committees. Once these funds leave the FEC's accounting system, it is much more difficult to obtain information on their ultimate disposition, which remains at the discretion of the former member. The ability of former members of Congress who contribute millions of dollars in political contributions from their personal PACs or campaign committees raise some serious ethical questions. Not only are they giving away other people's money, generally without the knowledge of the original donors, they also have the ability to distribute funds to lawmakers they may be attempting to influence in post-retirement lobbying careers. The Center for Public Integrity has identified 21 grandfathered former members of the House and 1 former senator who are currently working in post-retirement lobbying careers, mostly in Washington. Among the numerous examples of such lawmakers turned lobbyists now in the reverse role of campaign benefactor is Norman Lent, former ranking Republican on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, who distributed approximately $15,000 in leftover campaign funds to 21 members of Congress, including 7 Democrats, after leaving the office in 1993. He also gave $20,000 to 23 Republicans and 1 Democratic member in 1992. His Washington lobbying firm, Lent and Scrivener, which he formed with his former administrative assistant, has registered to lobby for Mobil, Pfizer, and other corporate clients involved in such areas as investment banking, natural gas, and telecommunications. Another grandfathered former member working as a Washington lobbyist, Ronnie Flippo, Democrat of Alabama, had nearly $500,000 in funds remaining in his campaign treasury after losing a 1990 gubernatorial bid. His committee's political contributions since then total $47,000, of which $27,000 was given in 1992 to 35 members of Congress of both parties. Flippo's client roster includes the state of Alabama, Alabama Power Company, Norfolk Southern Corporation, South Central Bell, Federal Express, RJR Nabisco, and others. Nearly 5 years after Congress reluctantly moved to phase out the controversial provision allowing former members to keep unspent campaign contributions for themselves, today an estimated $3.2 million still remains on hand in the campaign treasuries of 23 grandfathered former members who continue to be eligible to transfer the money to personal use, but who have not yet disposed of the funds. The American people are deeply suspicious of Congress, and there is a persistent perception out there that individual elected officials are out of touch with ordinary, everyday citizens, and worse, that they are principally interested in feathering their own nests. I must say that the findings of this study don't exactly bolster our confidence in Congress. The idea that several members have in effect been writing themselves millions of dollars in checks from leftover campaign money remains appalling. The grandfather clause is like a bad dream that doesn't end. Most retiring Americans are content with a handshake, a gold watch, and a modest pension. For some of these former members who have wonderful pensions, retirement was like winning a lottery, without the long odds and without the suspense. Despite all the work it took to produce this study, we have really only scratched the surface. New FEC records will be made public at the end of next month. Questions remain about those former members who are using their money today as Washington lobbyists. I urge everyone to take this information as a starting point. as a means to encourage accountability. As Chekhov said, man will become better only when you make him see what he is like. Besides the author, Kevin Chafee, I want to thank everyone who assisted with this project. Amy Bohm, Katie Crocker, Matt Draper, Margaret Ibram, Bill Hogan, Reyes Casamali, John Kruger, Dan Maffei, Tracy Mobley Martinez, Tony Pauls, Diane Renzulli, Jen Roselli, Rob Schlesinger, and Kara Ritter. Thank you. And now Kevin and I will take questions.
Are the 7 foundations enumerated in the book?
Yes.
They are?
Yeah.
Mr. Lewis, would you give us some idea how this money is being spent? Where are they putting their cash down? What are they buying?
Well, it's a variety of things. Some of them are putting them in CDs and personal checking accounts and bank accounts. Over the 15 years, some of them are doing museums in their own name, Cadillacs, Lincoln Continentals. I mean, there's a wide range of things they've used to spend it on. 10 or so members spend it on legal funds, $300,000 and $400,000 at a time going to their lawyers. A lot of it is the beneficiaries when they die, which we mentioned. And now we have some of these new phenomenons with charitable trusts and things that they're doing, but they're not really using it for charitable trusts, it appears, in some cases.
When you mean museums, museums to themselves, museums?
Right. One member of Congress in Missouri started a museum with his own name, in his own name, about himself. $50,000 or more, I believe.
It was basically a shrine to his long congressional service.
Who was this?
Gene Taylor, of Republican of Missouri, he put 50 or 55,000, something in that range, into a room in a small country store in a small town in Missouri. That's kind of a shrine to, as I said, a shrine to his years of service.
You mentioned Congressman Lehman from Florida who retired and left, I think, a grandson $1,000 for a future campaign for Congress some 20 years from now. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And how much of a stretch is that?
Well, I don't know. It seems almost like a joke. He was perfectly entitled to do it. If he wanted to give a political contribution to someone, he can do so. And if he wants to give it to someone who's 6 years old, who's not yet a candidate, I suppose he could do that too.
Let me ask a question about the lobbying. Although the principle, I guess, that you're pointing out here, retiring and then taking your campaign funds and start laying money out to people that are still in office and can help you, is certainly one that we need to be concerned about. 15,000 and 40,000 doesn't sound like enough money to do much influence buying.
Well, it's just.
How can we be alarmed about this when the numbers are?
Well, I think it's just the beginning. There are a great amount of unspent campaign funds left in these remaining treasuries or PACs of former members, and there's a good number of them who are working as lobbyists in Washington or in some cases elsewhere. They have this money at their disposal in the future. So since it's only something that's really been looked into by us in the last year or two, it's just the beginning, I would say. I think that's one of the main points of this report, is to tell you as members of the press to keep an eye on this in the future, because it's not only the grandfathered members who have access to this type of money for potential political use, it's the ungrandfathered members as well, who at the end of this Congress, there's going to be another 50 or 60, 70, 80 members out there. Some of them will be lobbyists, and some of them will have excess funds to use.
You haven't really made clear in your comments what you think they should be required to do.
Well, that's your
Yeah, I think that most Americans will feel more content with them giving it to charity, giving it back to the political party, giving it to universities, giving it to even back to the donors themselves. There is no stipulation what they must do with them. It's kind of open-ended. We're not an advocacy group. We're a research organization. We don't we're not we're not like Common Cause or Public Citizen or other groups. We're not pushing some bill that says you should end it today, because frankly Congress will never end it. They feel they disposed of this in '89. But there are certain ways of using this money that I think are less onerous and have less of a stench, frankly.
Some of the things that have been suggested are to return it to the federal government, which I think might have some tax implications to the people who had originally given it.
But you all aren't advocating any particular
No.
change, nor have you researched and planned those who've refunded the money? Do you have any research as to, can you give us an example of somebody who's
We have
simply given it back?
an entire appendix, I believe. It has,
Treasury Secretary Lloyd Benson has had a very substantial campaign fund, and almost all of it has been returned to the original donors. Former Senators Russell Long of Louisiana and Paul Tribble of Virginia both did the same thing, and there are a number of congressmen who have refunded funds. But it's always, someone told me once that it's very difficult to call up a member who's announced his retirement, who's continuing in office for a number of months and voting on legislation which may be of interest to you, and to ask him to refund your contribution. It's just something that hardly any PACs are willing to do.
You mentioned they can no longer use this money for personal use if they didn't retire last term. Is it conceivable, and it's my understanding they can only use it for political or charitable purpose. Is it conceivable that a former member could now retire, set up a charitable organization, and then draw a salary or get some benefit from that charitable organization? Would that be legitimate or legal under this still?
I think that's probably a matter that the IRS would have to resolve. As far as we're concerned, once it leaves the FEC, there's really no way of tracking it unless someone goes to the former member himself or goes to the state where the charity or the trust might have been set up. It's very difficult to trace it.
But is it possible for
I think it's probably possible. But there are guidelines for FEC of how much can be spent, of the IRS, of how much can be spent for administration.
Two of the worst abusers are from Kentucky. What did you find? Larry Hopkins was using that money for Carol Hubbard as well. And any coincidence that they're both from Kentucky?
No, I don't really think so. There's no real framework to establish a pattern. It goes across party lines, across ideological lines, across geographical lines.
What did you find Larry Hopkins?
Well, no one knows. You see, once his $665,000 left the FEC reporting system, it's transferred into his personal account. Presumably, he would have to pay income taxes on it.
What, did you take it out as a lump?
Yeah. I believe it was. It might have been in a couple of payouts.
There is a story behind that, though. He had to, he did resign his job here. Can you?
Well, he was not. As far as I know, he was not forced to resign in any public way. Someone might have suggested that he resign. I mean, I have no idea. He was staked out by, I believe it was an NBC News team, and he left his job at the Agriculture Department afterwards. His salary was in the $100,000 range there, from what I understand.
The FEC gives tremendous leeway in how you spend leftover campaign funds. You don't suggest that they should be tightening up those rules? I know there's...
Well, they're trying to. I know the FEC Council has been recommending to the FEC commissioners that certain things be done. One interesting thing, I think, which could tighten it up considerably if it would be enacted by Congress after the FEC commissioners approve it, would be to give the former members a 3-month period after they're leaving office with which to wind down the affairs of their committee. And after that, they wouldn't be able to continue to have all these political expenses, which they're allowed to do now. At this point, they can still be having staff expenses and office expenses a year after they've left office, and it's legal.
What's the difference between giving to another member of Congress as a political expense and going back to your home state to set up a life as a lawyer or run for governor in 10 years and giving $100,000 to your state university? It's just as political, isn't it?
Well, some people think that even the charitable uses of these funds will be of ultimate benefit to the member. You know, you give a $500,000 to your ex-university, which then hires you as a professor or something like that. You know. There's always a benefit to in being a benefactor.
Just to be clear, is this reported as personal income after it's converted for income tax
Well, the
purposes?
IRS would indeed consider it to be like a windfall gain. So you'd have to pay the required amount of income tax.
It is definitely not tax-free.
Oh, no, not if they directly convert it to personal use.
And some members have complained about how much taxes they have to pay on their windfall, and once you want to get your handkerchief out, it's pretty bad.
Question on this timing. If you retired after the 91-92 session, that is before this session, you were still covered by the loophole, correct?
Yes.
Now, if you retire this year or next year or any time further, you're not covered by the loophole, but you still, the only restriction now is you can't convert it to personal use. You can still give it away or set up a
Still give it away,
foundation.
and I believe you can still continue to have political quote-unquote expenses.
You just can't convert it and
You
buy
cannot
a boat or
directly
something.
transfer it to your personal use.
Now, what was the genius of January 8th, 1980? That would have been the second year of a term. The elections would have been in 78. You'd serve 79, 80. 80 was an election year itself. Why would they pick the second year of what would be most people's
Well, I think
two-year
it was
term?
just they had to draw the line in the sand, and that was when it happened.
But I'm thinking about that right. 80 itself was an election year.
Right.
So January 8th, 1980, for most congressmen, they would have been starting the second year of a two-year term.
Well, most of the congressmen were grandfathered.
There was somebody who was elected in a special election, as I recall.
It would have covered anyone who was elected from a special election.
You mentioned several prominent members of the administration: Gore, Panetta, Espy, Aspen. What's your feeling about the money they spent?
Well, all of those instances were examples of spending the money for quote political unquote expenses. So, if you want to spend $15,000 on a reception at the Four Seasons Hotel for your friends and family and constituents, supporters, it's considered to be a political expense just as much as a political fundraiser's costs would be.
Did you see any problem with them doing
it's not
that?
the same as converting it to personal use. No, it's not that at all. It's just another example of using it for non-election related expenses.
When they converted it to personal use under the grandfather, they could do anything with it, but they still had to report that, correct? They still had to file with the FEC saying, I bought a cabin cruiser with $20,000.
If they dispense the money from the FEC accounts, you can trace what the use was for. If they transfer it out of the FEC, either as a lump sum payment to themselves, or they put it into a trust of some type, charitable or personal.
They'd report that, but then they could subsequently
report
do
that
something
it's
else that
gone
wouldn't
out,
be
and then
reported.
It's out of the system as far as the FEC is concerned.
That's the only advantage to the charitable trust, or their different tax treatment.
Well, I suppose it would vary depending upon the state that it was set up. But if it's a personal trust, who knows what that could be? I mean, there's one member, one that I can think of who set up a personal trust rather than a charitable trust.
Who is?
Therefore, to my mind, that sounds as if it could be for his grandchildren, or who knows.
Who's that?
Edward Madigan. But I believe didn't he claim that it was, a lot of them will take the funds, whether it's in a trust or whether it's a direct conversion to personal use, and will say that I'm going to give it away later to charity. In fact, many of them have done that, but you never know. I haven't really heard of anyone calling a press conference to announce a year after they took the money that they'd given it to some charities, although it's possible.
Is that what Madigan did?
Well, he still has most of his money on hand in this charitable trust.
In this personal
trust? He also
trust.
took $25,000 directly converted to personal use. But the bulk of his leftover funds, about $435,000, remains in this trust for unspecified future use.
How should campaign money be raised in contrast to the way it is now?
How should it be raised?
Yeah, how do they get the money in a different way instead of...
Well, they get money from from individual donors.
I know, but isn't there another way to raise campaign funds without going out and getting money from individuals?
Well, they also get it from political parties, and they also get it from political action committees that are representing
well, they-
labor unions.
They're trying to
and business.
do away with these PACs.
Well, if they would do away with PACs, they'd probably have a lot less money on hand to take with them when they left office.
Well, that's the cure for the problem.
Well, we're not advocating that, are we?
No, no.
You're not what?
I said we're not really taking a stand on whether PACs should be abolished or not.
You're not. But that contributes to the problem, doesn't it?
I would say that it does.
I don't think anyone is really happy with the existing political system in terms of campaign finance, and I think everyone recognizes, whether you're talking about PACs or you're talking about soft money, whether you're talking about the current campaign finance reform bill that seems to be stalled in the Congress.
What about that?
What about it?
The reform bill.
Well, that particular bill, I think the administration has not spent hardly any time on it. The president hasn't given any nationally televised speeches on it. The reform that they're proposing is incremental at best. Private funds will still come into campaigns from all directions. If you're saying to me, is it incremental and is it good that we have it's a step in the right direction, yes. Or if anyone is suggesting it's a panacea or that the problem of private abuse in the campaign process will end, certainly it will not. So that's my impression of it all. Yeah.
As you said, there's nothing legal about this practice, but Carol Hubbard tomorrow will be sentenced for other violations, campaign finance violations. Is there anything to indicate this kind of behavior indicates other kind of illegal activity, that some of these people have not been caught? There may be other Carol Hubbards in this list?
Well, I just read in one of the major newspapers last week that I think it was ex-governor and ex-representative from Delaware, Pierre DuPont, who just wrote an essay. It was in my newspaper, the Washington Times, which said that some incredible number of members of Congress have been indicted or served prison terms since he was in office in the House in 1970. So something like 60 members. I don't have that exact number at the tip of my tongue, but it would lead you to believe that it's an ongoing problem, and where there's an opportunity to have some smoke, there's some fire as well.
The specific answer to this study is we're also not prosecutors, and we weren't looking for illegal abuses. We were mostly just trying to lay out the landscape and see who's been doing what. So the short answer is we don't have any examples of abuse. And I would also, I'm not an expert on the Hubbard case, but it's a fairly peculiar case where he was an FBI informant against his former members, and there's some question of his degree of cooperation with the FBI and the Justice Department, and they had a fairly intimate familiarity with his activities as a congressman and a former member that most former members do not have that kind of scrutiny, to be perfectly candid about it. It does make you scratch your head and wonder how. I don't know that he's an aberration, but we don't know that for sure, and all we can do is tell you what's in the FEC records.
Do you think it's appropriate for those campaign funds then to be used in their legal defenses?
Well, some people think that they should set up separate defense funds, which is in the news today as well from the point of view of the president, and not use election funds for these purposes. I mean, I suppose you could draw an analogy with President Clinton's situation, and if he were using his funds from the Democratic National Committee or from his presidential campaign to pay for legal expenses for a completely non-related problem that he has to his congressional service.
As I understand it, the Clinton administration and the president himself, according to published accounts, rejected specifically the notion of taking campaign funds to pay off his legal defense. And his reason was not that it would be illegal, but that it would be politically onerous. And it's a subjective thing and it's impressionistic, but I think that when you have someone who is using leftover campaign funds for their personal use, and they also happen to be indicted, and they're using it for their lawyers, I just think the donors, when they gave the money, did not know that they were helping someone get out of a legal jam because of an FBI sting. They thought they were actually helping someone get elected in a democracy. They are two separate things, and you know, not to be too nitpicky about it, but I don't think that's what the idea was. And I don't think the average American thinks that when you give money to a candidate, you might also help him get out of a legal jam someday. I don't think that's the idea.
Than allowing so-called double dipping from somebody like the president, who can then go back to the well a second time and start a whole new fund and call in favors from
Well, Dan Rosikowski's probably doing the same thing. I mean, he's got like $1 million. I'm sorry?
That's worse or more onerous than, or less onerous?
Well,
we don't have an onerous meter here. They're all not so great. They all make us want to hold our nose. And I don't know what's better or what's worse. The issue is it continues to reinforce the suspicion and distrust that the American people have about this town and the way it's run and the Congress and elected officials. And I think that's the issue here. And nitpicking about which is worse and which is better, they are not. None of them are particularly appealing, and none of them lend dignity to public service.
You said in your opening remarks that there were no illegalities, but there are a couple members you have listed. The ones that spring to mind are Aspen and Weicker, I think, who did transfer, it appears, to personal use and are not covered by the grandfather clause. That would appear to be illegal. I mean, Aspen, at least what you say, is just put it in CDs and says he's going to use it for political purpose in the future. And Weicker, I guess, has returned the money, but he did originally, even though he was a senator, transfer it to personal use. I mean, do you have any comment on the legality of that? I mean, it just appears on its face to be illegal.
Well, Weicker is a special case, and we threw in some senators because some of them have done some things with their leftover campaign funds, but technically they're not grandfathered. It only applied to the House. But the Senate has a rule that theoretically, at least, prohibits the personal use. Whether or not what you're describing is legal or illegal or violate the Senate rules, frankly, is up to the Senate Ethics Committee, which, you know, I wouldn't hold my breath. But the other case, Aspen, I have to say, any time when someone says they're moving a large sum of money that's in 6 figures into CDs, and we'll get back to you about what we're going to do with it, I have to say the antenna go up a little bit. He says, or he apparently has said to others, that he may run for elective office again. I haven't called the state chairman in Wisconsin to ask if he's filing next week, but I have a feeling, I haven't heard anything about him running for office. Maybe in 10 years he will, and he can certainly take that money and do it. All our job is, and I think anyone's job is to just lay out who's doing what and let them try to explain themselves. One of the amusing and depressing simultaneously things of this study are in the appendices. Some of the explanations that some of these former members have given about their money are contemptuous of the voters and the press, but also slightly amusing. One fellow took, I forget, $50,000 or $60,000, and reporters at the whatever town it was said, "What about this? You took this money. What'd you do with it?" And he said, "Geez, I can't remember." And some other people said I didn't have a hell of a lot of trouble with it. You know, I needed the money. Some others complained about the taxes. I'm trying to think what if you read through the appendix, the first appendix, some of the explanations are just nothing short of extraordinary.
When you get them.
Yeah, when you get them. And many times you don't get them, and many times people don't ask them, what happened? Why'd you take this money? There are a number of people from when we put the first look at it in '91, a lot of people never, ever asked these people what they did with their money to this day. And I think if I had the time and the energy and we weren't doing a healthcare study that comes out in 2 weeks, you know, I would go to every one of these people and say, what did you do with this money and what are you going to do, and show us your statements and open up your files and get some sort of commitment from them about what they're going to do. And there's not that accountability right now.
Does it bother you with the prospects of future FEC enforcement? I mean, they are toying with the personal use rules now, but does it bother you that people who are not covered by the grandfather clause seemingly were allowed to do what they... I mean, some of the ones are political in nature. Some of the as you mentioned, the administration people haven't classified them as sort of political in nature. But some of the ones who are not covered by the grandfather clause, at least according to your documentation, appears to be almost direct personal use. Does that concern you? Is the FEC, not enforcing those things? I mean,
there is a general controversy that we're aware of, and I'm sure many of you are aware of, that many people in this town are concerned about campaign expenses and how loosely administered and monitored they are by the FEC. The FEC, when they finally do go after someone, it's usually 10 years ago, or I think they just had something the other day about the '88 election, 6 years later. I mean, if you're going to have enforcement about election abuses, it would be useful to do it maybe in the 2 or 3 year period that they occurred. So I don't think anyone, and this is well known, and there's all kinds of reasons. Actually, books have been written about this. Why is the FEC, when it comes to enforcement, relatively ineffectual? We could talk for hours about that. But specifically, there is a controversy now, and there is some talk of tightening up specifically the campaign expenses. What is legal, what is not legal, what is reportable, what is not reportable. Just in the Rostenkowski case, you had some very interesting things with leased cars and things like that, the former Ways and Means Chairman is not the only one who ever leased a car in a campaign and ended up having it later. And there's very little scrutiny about it, there's very little enforcement, and not only by the FEC, but, you know, after that, with journalists and academicians in every district. You know, again, the best of all worlds, I would camp out over there and go between the campaign records and their own personal financial disclosure records and everything else. I would juxtapose records and I would match up and see who's doing what. And there's just not enough hours in the day.
That these conversions have had, might have had any effect on public policy. In other words, any of these people who converted the money to their own use, did they especially favor contributors in their votes or in committees and that sort of thing, in the official business?
Well, that's for you to find out, I would say. We could not go into every single contribution of all of these hundreds of members and do individual case studies. It would have been impossible. So that's what we're hoping members of the press will do, especially some of the local press who are covering their ex-congressman. And I wanted to point out one thing to you about the Aspen case. I believe he was a grandfathered member. Unless he was sworn in as a member of Congress for a few days and served after being reelected. Before he became Secretary of Defense, he would have been a grandfathered member. I don't remember, as a matter of fact, whether he in fact served. If he may not have taken his oath of office to serve in Congress for a few days.
What happens when committee is terminated with funds on hand?
It just kind of goes out into the netherworld. It's the same as, I've always treated that as a conversion to personal use because they just seem to stop filing a report. Sometimes the FEC will later determine that that was the ultimate disposition of the funds. But if you're interested in a specific case, you'd probably have to follow that up with the FEC to find out.
If you're going to run again, you can use this money towards your next campaign.
Members who are going to run again can maintain their funds. Dick Cheney, the former congressman from Wyoming and who became Secretary of Defense, still maintains his fund, and he's basically using it for political purposes in his own behalf at this time. Vice President Quayle, ex-Vice President Quayle, also has funds on hand that he's kept intact for future political use, and there's no problem with that whatsoever.
His museum.
Well, I don't know that he has a museum yet.
Yeah, he has something in Indianapolis.
Well, he hasn't used his campaign funds to sustain it then.
He's got plenty of money.
In terms of the members who are retiring this year, you list how much money is left in their campaign fund, but there's no indication of where the rest of it went, and some of the numbers are quite small. Is this money that's been used for political donations?
You're talking about members who are soon to retire?
Yeah.
Well, all we did was report on the latest FEC amount figures that they have on hand. We didn't really go into, well, they're still in office. They're still in office and they still have political expenses.
Could you shed some light on what Governor Weicker did or did not do with his war chest of funds before he left the Senate?
The most we could find out was that he had later claimed that the issue of his use of these funds was brought up in his gubernatorial campaign. And from what I understand was that he later announced that the funds had been transferred from his personal account to charities, a requisite amount of what was taken. And I'm sure that was probably done. He's a wealthy man and probably makes large contributions anyway. So
There are some members of Congress, notably Senator Mitchell, who are interested, it seems, in campaign reform. Has anybody gone on record as supporting a change in this grandfather clause, as you've called it?
well, most of them have gone on record in favor of the law as it was changed a couple of years ago. There's really been not much talk since then of further tightening of these rules. You mean eliminating it for the few grandfathers who remain now and doing it retroactively?
Yes.
There has been very little discussion of this. I think the members of Congress who voted on this thought that they were getting rid of this issue at the time, and there's not much interest in really reviving it, although that could change.
When we did the study a few years ago, in March '91, we pointed out what you're describing, the '89 law, and why did they phase it out? I mean, if it was something that they thought was improper or would bring further disdain on the institution of Congress, why not just end it immediately? Well, the answer is they couldn't get the votes. A lot of the senior members of the House had these huge sums of money sitting there, and they were anxious to take them, and they weren't going to let it ever be voted on. So the only deal that could be crafted was a phased-out way, which, you know, the good news is it's ending. The bad news is it seems to be taking years and years to end, and that's what I was making the analogy to a bad dream that doesn't end. On the influence thing about policy over here, I wanted to follow up. On some of the 20 or so former members who are now lobbyists and are using this money for contributions, it would be interesting. I admit that the amounts of money are not huge, but it would be very interesting. In some cases, I suspect, and I think if you look closely at their clients and you look at where they're giving money, one former member was pouring money into the Ways and Means Committee, which handles so many different things. Some of the clients that he dealt with or was representing could, in fact, I mean, that could certainly facilitate things. The other thing about former members and the amounts of money, that the double or triple whammy here is that former members of Congress as lobbyists have an incredible advantage over all other lobbyists. They get to hang out with these guys in the House gym and go on the House and Senate floor, and they're giving them money on top of that. So the amount of influence and schmoozing that they can bring to bear on their former colleagues is really quite extraordinary. And that's why this latest development, it's like adding another couple sticks of dynamite to an already explosive situation that, you know, it's not so wonderful.
It's very important to note that the two members which we highlighted in our study, Lent and Flippo, both gave campaign contributions to former colleagues of both parties. This is really a very unusual thing to see. I've looked at these records for many years and can only remember one or two instances where a former member of Congress gave a political contribution to a colleague of the opposite party. And that was in the case of someone, I believe, from Pennsylvania whose friend of 20 years in Congress from a neighboring district happened to be from the other party, and he gave him $1,000.
Were they all one committee? Was Lent all given to Energy and Commerce people?
I think it was largely that, but other members as well.
I think it's one historical question. Before the clause was actually created in '80, what was the practice? I mean, was there any rules governing, you know, once you retired, what you do with the money?
Well, this was the pre-PAC era, and they didn't have all this leftover money, so it wasn't a problem. There were a few instances where some former congressmen used their excess funds from their stationary account that were tight with the money that they let their staff use, and then they kept it. And there was a few scandals about that. But there just wasn't the amount of money out there in the pre-PAC era that to make it an issue, much of an issue. No one knows, because the FEC only came into existence in the late 70s, so no one knows.
Well, usually candidates say they don't have enough money, and I'm so surprised that there's so much money left over for the campaign.
That's a lot of people in the United States are surprised that they have so much money left over. They have no idea. They think that they need every penny, and they're going into debt in order to win their campaigns.
They don't point out this in their fundraising letters that
It's a good question.
they have 500,000 sitting in an account. That's usually not even in the fine print in the solicitation letters.
Congressman from, you know, the
Well,
area.
not all of them.
No, it depends on the congressman, and
How many congressmen do use this leftover money? I mean, in proportion to the size of the Congress.
well, 112 members took 10 million. If you go back over used, sorry, since '79, and I don't know how many. Well, there's always 535 members, but there's a lot of that came and went. So I don't know. You can work out those
So a lot of
percentages.
them don't use this leftover money.
Right. No, and we said that at the beginning. Many of them don't do that. That's absolutely right. And the other thing is, remember this when it says grandfather clause, the folks that were there before '80 and are still there in '92 and '93, a lot of them are in safe seats. They have no opponents, or hardly any opponents. They have used huge war chests, so people won't run because they see what they're up against. And so we're not talking usually about a freshman termer here. These are the lions of the institution who have been there forever. And they still get this money, of course, PAC money and everything else. Their committee chairman, everyone wants to be impress the chairman because their bill's before him. Even if he has a safe seat, even if he's unopposed, he's getting tons of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars pouring in. That's where this money came from.
I'm not going to contribute to my congressman anymore.
Thank you. Thanks.